Whispers of preparation. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of Southwick House, a grand estate transformed into the nerve centre of the most ambitious military operation the world had ever conceived. It was the spring of 1944, and within these walls, maps covered every available surface. Charts of tides, weather patterns, and German defensive positions stretched across tables that had once hosted elegant dinner parties. General Dwight Eisenhower stood before one such map, his hands clasped behind his back, studying the coastline of Normandy with the intensity of a man who understood that the fate of nations rested in the details. The weight of command had etched deeper lines around his eyes, but his voice remained steady as he addressed his staff. "Gentlemen," he would say, "we are not merely planning an invasion, we are orchestrating the return of freedom to Europe." The scale of Operation Overlord defied comprehension. Imagine, if you will, coordinating the movement of over 150,000 men across treacherous waters, managing 5,000 ships of every conceivable type, from massive battleships to humble landing craft. The logistics alone required the minds of mathematicians, meteorologists, and master strategists working in perfect harmony. In the months leading up to June 1944, England had become a vast staging ground. American GIs practiced amphibious landings on beaches that bore no resemblance to the Norman coast they would soon face. British commandos rehearsed night raids in conditions that mimicked the darkness they would encounter. Canadian forces honed their tactics in the rolling countryside that would prepare them for the hedgerows of France. The secrecy surrounding these preparations was absolute. Entire towns were evacuated to create practice zones. False radio traffic filled the airwaves, designed to convince German intelligence that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Every detail mattered. Every deception could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Perhaps most remarkably, this vast undertaking required the coordination of multiple nations, each with their own military traditions, languages, and tactical preferences. Eisenhower's greatest challenge was not merely defeating the Germans, but first uniting the Allies under a single vision of victory. The eve of destiny. June 5, 1944 dawned grey and forbidding across southern England. The wind howled across the airfields where paratroopers made final checks on their equipment, their faces painted with camouflage that couldn't quite mask their apprehension. These were young men, many barely out of their teens, preparing to leap into the darkness over occupied France. At Southwick House, the tension was palpable. Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist, entered the briefing room carrying weather reports that would determine the course of history. His Scottish accent cut through the cigarette smoke as he delivered news that no one wanted to hear. The weather for June 5th remains unsuitable for the operation. Eisenhower listened in silence, his fingers drumming against the polished table. The invasion had already been postponed once. Ships were loaded, men were briefed, and the element of surprise hung by the thinnest of threads. Each day of delay increased the risk that German intelligence would uncover their plans. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, ever confident, argued for proceeding despite the weather. His crisp British accent carried the authority of a man who had faced Rommel in the desert and emerged victorious. "We've trained for adverse conditions," he insisted. "Our boys are ready." General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, was more cautious. His quiet Missouri drawl reflected the methodical thinking that had earned him Eisenhower's trust. "We can't ask our men to storm those beaches if our naval bombardment can't find its targets through the clouds." Outside, across the harbors and estuaries of southern England, the greatest armada ever assembled waited at anchor. Picture, if you will, Portsmouth Harbor filled with ships of every description. Landing ship tanks with their bow doors sealed tight, destroyers riding high in the water, their crews checking and rechecking their guns. Transport vessels crowded with soldiers who had been sealed aboard for days, playing cards, writing letters home, and trying not to think about what lay ahead. The statistics were staggering. Over 5,000 vessels of all types, from the mighty battleship HMS Warspite to small patrol boats that would guide the first waves to shore. Nearly 200,000 naval personnel from multiple nations, speaking different languages but united in purpose. The loading alone had taken weeks. Ammunition, medical supplies, vehicles, fuel, food for an army that would need to sustain itself on hostile shores. Many of the American soldiers had never seen combat. They came from farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, and offices in New York. Now they found themselves part of something larger than they could have imagined. British veterans of North Africa and Italy shared their knowledge with these newcomers, while Canadian forces, eager to return to the continent they had helped defend, prepared for their own crucial role. As evening approached on June 5th, Stagg returned with updated forecasts. A brief window of improved weather was possible. Not ideal conditions, but perhaps workable. The room fell silent as Eisenhower weighed the decision that would echo through history. Too early, and they might face impossible weather. Too late, and the tides would no longer favor their landing craft. "We go," he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had united the Allied command. "The operation will commence tomorrow morning." The die was cast. Hand, shadows in the night, airborne. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, the sky over Normandy filled with the steady drone of aircraft engines. More than 800 transport planes, their navigation lights extinguished, flew in precise formations through the night. Inside these aircraft, paratroopers sat in rows, their equipment strapped tight, their faces illuminated only by the occasional glow of a cigarette. These were the Pathfinders and the first assault waves. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, elite units trained for exactly this moment. Their mission was deceptively simple: secure key bridges, crossroads, and causeways behind the German lines before the beach landings began. In practice, it meant jumping into unknown territory, in darkness, with only their training and courage to guide them. The aircraft encountered unexpected cloud cover as they approached the Norman coast. Pilots, flying by instruments and dead reckoning, struggled to find their designated drop zones. Anti-aircraft fire began to flicker up from German positions, creating deadly fireworks in the night sky. Some planes took evasive action, scattering their passengers across miles of unfamiliar countryside. Private First Class John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself dangling from the church steeple in Sainte-Mère-Église, his parachute caught on the stone tower. Below him, the town square was eerily quiet, but he could hear the distant sound of gunfire as his comrades engaged German defenders. For hours he hung motionless, playing dead while German soldiers passed beneath him. Many paratroopers landed far from their intended targets, scattered across the bocage country of Normandy with its maze of hedgerows and narrow lanes. In the darkness, they used small metal crickets, devices that made a distinctive clicking sound, to identify friend from foe. The password flash met with the countersign thunder as small groups of soldiers found each other in the pre-dawn gloom. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort, despite a broken ankle suffered during his jump, rallied his men for an assault on the village of Sainte-Mère-Église. His calm leadership in those crucial hours demonstrated the quality of training that had prepared these elite units for independent action behind enemy lines. The French resistance played a crucial role in these early hours. For 4 years, they had endured occupation, gathering intelligence and waiting for this moment. Now, as Allied paratroopers dropped from the sky, resistance fighters emerged from hiding to guide them to their objectives, cut telephone lines, and spread confusion among German defenders. Marie Harel, a French schoolteacher turned resistance operative, had memorized every German position in her village. When American paratroopers appeared at her door, she led them through back gardens and forgotten paths, avoiding enemy patrols with the intimate knowledge that only a local could possess. Her courage, multiplied by hundreds of similar acts across Normandy, proved invaluable to the success of the airborne operations. The mission to secure Pegasus Bridge fell to Major John Howard and his glider-borne force. 6 Horsa gliders, each carrying 30 men, landed within yards of their target in what would be remembered as one of the most precise operations of the war. The bridge, vital for preventing German reinforcements from reaching the beaches, was captured within minutes of landing. As dawn approached, scattered groups of paratroopers began to coalesce around their objectives. They had achieved something remarkable. Not the textbook operation they had trained for, but something perhaps more valuable. Their very dispersion had created confusion among German defenders who received reports of Allied soldiers appearing everywhere at once, making it impossible to determine the true scope and direction of the invasion. The airborne assault, for all its apparent chaos, had succeeded in its primary mission, creating a protective screen behind the beaches where, in just a few hours, the largest seaborne invasion in history would begin. Dawn's first light, the Channel crossing. As the first pale light of dawn touched the waters of the English Channel, an extraordinary sight emerged from the morning mist. Stretching from horizon to horizon, the Allied invasion fleet moved steadily toward the coast of France. The sea itself seemed to have been transformed into a highway of ships, each vessel playing its part in the grand symphony of Operation Overlord. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, the naval commander responsible for this maritime miracle, had spent months perfecting the choreography of the crossing. Every ship had its designated route, its specific timing, its particular role in the unfolding drama. The faster vessels had departed later, while the slower landing craft had begun their journey in the dark hours before dawn, all converging on the Norman beaches with mathematical precision. Picture the scene from the bridge of HMS Scylla, Ramsay's flagship. In every direction, ships moved through the gentle swells of the channel. To port, a column of American destroyers maintained perfect formation, their crews at battle stations. To starboard, British cruisers rode the waves with practiced ease, their guns trained toward the invisible French coast. Ahead and behind, transport vessels carried the precious cargo of liberation. Thousands upon thousands of young men who would soon test their courage against the Atlantic Wall. The crossing itself was remarkably peaceful. German naval forces, weakened by years of warfare, offered no significant challenge to the armada. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, could muster only token resistance. The Allies had achieved something that had seemed impossible just months earlier: complete control of the sea and air over the invasion route. Aboard the transport ships, soldiers dealt with the crossing in their own ways. Some played poker with worn cards, their concentration focused on anything but the approaching coastline. Others wrote final letters home, knowing they might not have another chance. Many simply sat in silence, lost in thoughts of family, home, and the uncertain hours ahead. Sergeant Robert Murphy, of the 1st Infantry Division, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, moved among his men, offering quiet reassurance. Just like Sicily, he told them, though he knew that wasn't quite true. The beaches of Normandy would present challenges unlike anything they had faced before. Still, his calm presence steadied the younger soldiers, many of whom were seeing combat for the first time. The medical personnel aboard the ships prepared for the inevitable casualties. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of the few women in the invasion fleet, checked and rechecked her supplies aboard a hospital ship. She had volunteered for this duty, knowing that her skills would be desperately needed in the hours to come. Her quiet professionalism exemplified the thousands of support personnel who made the invasion possible. As the fleet approached the Norman coast, the first sounds of battle began to echo across the water. Allied bombers, wave after wave of them, pounded German positions along the shoreline. The thunder of their engines mixed with the distant rumble of explosions as tons of ordnance fell on enemy fortifications. Naval gunfire soon joined the bombardment. The great guns of battleships and cruisers opened fire, their shells screaming overhead toward targets identified by months of reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. HMS Warspite, a veteran of 2 world wars, added her voice to the chorus, her 15-inch guns reaching deep into German defensive positions. From the decks of the transport ships, soldiers could see the French coastline emerging from the morning haze. The beaches of Normandy, peaceful fishing villages just hours before, were now shrouded in smoke and dust from the Allied bombardment. Church spires and coastal landmarks, studied so carefully in briefing rooms across England, became real and immediate. The moment of truth was approaching. After years of preparation, months of training, and weeks of anticipation, the great test was about to begin. The largest seaborne invasion in history was entering its final phase, and every man in the fleet knew that the next few hours would determine the course of the war, and perhaps the future of civilization itself. The beaches of Normandy. At precisely 6:30 a.m., the first landing craft touched the sands of Normandy. 5 beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, became the focal points of the greatest amphibious assault in military history. Each beach presented its own unique challenges, its own obstacles, its own test of courage and determination. Utah Beach, the westernmost landing site, proved to be something of an anomaly. Strong currents had pushed the first wave of landing craft nearly a mile south of their intended target, but this apparent mishap turned into an unexpected advantage. The area where they actually landed was more lightly defended than their original objective. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president and the only general officer to land with the first wave, made the crucial decision, "We'll start the war from right here." The obstacles that awaited the Allied forces had been months in the making. German engineers, under the direction of Field Marshal Rommel, had turned the beaches into a maze of defensive positions. Steel hedgehogs, twisted metal barriers designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft, jutted from the sand like prehistoric creatures. Concrete bunkers, their guns carefully sighted to cover every approach, commanded fields of fire that had been precisely calculated and rehearsed. At Omaha Beach, the American forces faced their greatest challenge. The beach was dominated by high bluffs that provided perfect defensive positions for German machine gun nests and artillery observers. The preliminary bombardment, which had been so effective elsewhere, had largely missed the well-concealed German positions here. The first waves of landing craft approached through choppy seas that made accurate navigation difficult. Many of the specialized Sherman tanks, modified to operate in water, were launched too far from shore and sank in the rough waters. The soldiers who made it to the beach found themselves pinned down by withering fire from positions they could barely see. Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson, a squad leader from the 1st Infantry Division, found himself among the first Americans to reach Omaha Beach. The ramp of his landing craft dropped, and immediately the sound of machine gun fire filled the air. "Move! Keep moving!" he shouted to his men, knowing that staying still meant certain death. The beach was littered with obstacles, both man-made and natural, that provided the only cover available. Gold Beach saw the landing of British forces under the command of the 50th Infantry Division. Here, the specialized armor that the British had developed proved its worth. Flail tanks, equipped with rotating chains to detonate mines, cleared paths through the obstacles. AVRE tanks, armored vehicle Royal Engineers, used their massive mortars to blast gaps in the German defenses. The town of Arromanches, just behind Gold Beach, would soon become the site of one of the war's most remarkable engineering achievements. Mulberry Harbor, a prefabricated port that would allow the Allies to land supplies directly onto the Norman coast. But on the morning of June 6th, it was simply another objective to be secured by infantry advancing through the maze of coastal defenses. Canadian forces at Juno Beach faced some of the stiffest resistance of the day. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by armor from the Fort Garry Horse, fought their way through beach obstacles and into the heavily fortified seaside towns. Major David Curry, who would later receive the Victoria Cross for his actions in Normandy, led his squadron of Sherman tanks through the narrow streets, engaging German anti-tank guns at point-blank range. Sword Beach, the easternmost landing site, was assigned to British and Free French forces. Here, the objective was not just to secure a beachhead, but to link up with the airborne forces who had landed during the night. Lord Lovat's commandos, identified by their distinctive green berets, moved inland with their characteristic precision and speed. The sound of bagpipes cut through the noise of battle as Piper Bill Millin, ignoring orders that prohibited the instrument in combat, played his men ashore. The haunting melody of Highland Laddie provided an incongruous soundtrack to the deadly serious business of amphibious warfare, but it served its purpose, giving the men something familiar to focus on amid the chaos of battle. By noon, all 5 beaches were secured, though at varying costs. The foothold in Europe, purchased with such courage and sacrifice, was still tenuous. German reserves were moving toward the coast, and the critical period of consolidation was about to begin. The success of D-Day would ultimately be measured not by the landings themselves, but by the Allies' ability to expand and reinforce their beachheads in the crucial hours and days that followed. Aftermath and consolidation. As the sun reached its zenith over the Norman coast, the character of the invasion began to change. The dramatic assault phase was giving way to the equally critical but less glamorous work of consolidation. Beaches that had been battlefields just hours before were now becoming the lifelines of the Allied forces in France. The medical corps moved with practiced efficiency among the wounded. Field hospitals, established in abandoned buildings and hastily erected tents, became centres of quiet heroism. Dr. Margaret Stevens, a British Army surgeon, worked without pause to save lives that hung in the balance. Her hands, steady despite exhaustion, represented the thousands of medical personnel who had trained for this moment, knowing that their skills would mean the difference between life and death for countless young soldiers. The beach masters, officers responsible for organizing the controlled chaos of an amphibious landing, began the enormous task of turning sand and surf into functioning supply bases. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson, beachmaster at Omaha, coordinated the landing of vehicles, ammunition, fuel, and the 1,000 other items that a modern army requires. His organizational skills, honed through months of training exercises, were now being tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Supply ships, their holds packed with everything from medical supplies to spare tank tracks, began the careful process of unloading their cargo. Bulldozers carved roads through the sand dunes, while engineers worked to clear the beach obstacles that had claimed so many landing craft during the assault. The twisted metal barriers that had seemed so formidable in the morning were now being systematically removed or bypassed. The human cost of the invasion was becoming clear as casualty reports filtered back to headquarters. Every name represented a family somewhere who would soon receive news that would change their lives forever. But even in the midst of grief, there was recognition that the sacrifice had not been in vain. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impregnable coastal fortress, had been breached. Chaplain Michael O'Brien moved among the wounded and the dying, offering comfort that transcended religious boundaries. His presence brought peace to soldiers of all faiths, and his quiet words helped many find meaning in the chaos that surrounded them. The spiritual dimension of warfare, often overlooked in tactical analyses, was embodied in men like O'Brien, who ministered to souls under fire. As afternoon turned to evening, the focus shifted to expanding the beachheads inland. Reconnaissance patrols probed German defences, searching for weak points that could be exploited. The bocage country of Normandy, with its maze of hedgerows, narrow lanes and small fields, would present challenges that no amount of training in England had fully prepared the Allies to face. Combat engineers worked to establish communication lines between the scattered beachheads. Radio equipment, some damaged by seawater during the landing, was repaired or replaced. The complex web of communications that linked individual squads to divisional headquarters and ultimately to Eisenhower's command post in England began to take shape. The French civilian population, caught between the German defenders and the Allied liberators, faced their own trials. Many had spent the night in cellars and bomb shelters, emerging to find their familiar world transformed. Some greeted the Allied soldiers as liberators, while others simply tried to survive in a landscape that had become a battlefield overnight. Supply convoys began moving inland, following routes that had been planned months in advance, but were now being tested under combat conditions. Military police directed traffic, medics established aid stations, and quartermasters set up supply dumps. The invasion was evolving from a military operation into an occupation, the first step in the long journey that would eventually lead to Berlin. As darkness fell over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Allied forces could claim success. The beachheads were secure, reinforcements were arriving, and the German response had been slower and less coordinated than feared. But everyone understood that D-Day was only the beginning. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, as the Allies attempted to break out of their coastal enclaves and begin the liberation of Western Europe. Hamburg, inland journey and the local population. The Norman countryside, with its ancient stone walls and centuries-old hedgerows, had never witnessed anything like the mechanized columns that now moved through its narrow lanes. As Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches, they encountered a landscape that was both beautiful and treacherous, a patchwork of small fields and thick vegetation that provided perfect cover for defenders. The bocage, as this distinctive terrain was known, had been shaped by 1,000 years of French agriculture. Each field was surrounded by earthen banks topped with dense hedgerows, creating natural fortifications that German defenders had learned to use with deadly effectiveness. What had appeared on aerial photographs as simple farmland revealed itself to be a maze of potential ambush sites and natural barriers. Captain James Mitchell, leading a company of American infantry through the village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, found himself face to face with the human dimension of the invasion. French civilians, emerging from cellars where they had sheltered during the bombardment, regarded the American soldiers with a mixture of hope and apprehension. 4 years of occupation had taught them to be cautious about any armed men, regardless of their nationality. Madame Dubois, an elderly Frenchwoman whose farmhouse had been damaged by shellfire, offered water to the passing soldiers despite her own losses. Her gesture, repeated countless times across Normandy, demonstrated the resilience of the French people and their recognition that liberation, however costly, was finally at hand. The language barrier created its own challenges, and occasionally its own moments of unexpected humor. Sergeant William O'Connor, armed with a phrasebook and determined optimism, attempted to explain to a French farmer that his field would be needed as a temporary ammunition dump. The conversation, conducted in fractured French and expressive gestures, somehow succeeded in conveying both necessity and respect for the farmer's property. Children, their eyes wide with wonder at the foreign soldiers, began to appear on the streets of liberated villages. Many had never seen a black American soldier before, and the racial integration of some American units provided French youngsters with their first lesson in the diversity of the nation that had come to liberate them. These small encounters, multiplied across hundreds of villages, began the process of cultural exchange that would reshape both nations. The destruction caused by the preliminary bombardment was evident everywhere. Church steeples, used as observation posts by German artillery spotters, had been particular targets of Allied fire. The ancient stones of Norman churches, which had witnessed the passage of centuries, now bore the scars of modern warfare. Supply convoys, stretching for miles along the narrow roads, brought the tools of liberation: ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and food. Military police worked to maintain traffic flow, but the Norman road system had never been designed for the massive logistical requirements of a modern army. Bottlenecks developed at bridges and crossroads, creating tempting targets for German artillery observers. The port of Cherbourg, at the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, became a primary objective for American forces. This deep-water harbor would be essential for landing the heavy equipment and massive supplies needed to sustain the Allied advance. The German garrison, recognizing its strategic importance, prepared for a siege that would test both sides' determination. French resistance fighters, no longer operating in secret, emerged to provide invaluable intelligence about German positions and movements. Their knowledge of local terrain, combined with years of careful observation, made them perfect guides for Allied units navigating unfamiliar territory. The partnership between regular Allied forces and the French resistance represented one of the most successful collaborations between conventional and guerrilla forces in military history. As the first week of the invasion drew to a close, the Allied beachheads had expanded and merged into a continuous front stretching along the Norman coast. The immediate objectives had been achieved, but the greater challenge lay ahead. Breaking out of Normandy and beginning the drive toward Germany would require new tactics, continued courage, and the same careful planning that had made D-Day possible. The transformation of Normandy from peaceful countryside to active battlefield was complete. But beneath the surface of military operations, a more subtle transformation was also taking place: the renewal of friendship between peoples who had been separated by war, and the first steps toward a Europe that would eventually be united in peace rather than divided by conflict. Communications and the human element. In a canvas tent pitched beside a Norman farmhouse, the steady rhythm of Morse code created its own form of music. Corporal David Richardson, hunched over his radio equipment, maintained the vital link between forward units and divisional headquarters. His trained ear could distinguish between atmospheric interference and enemy jamming attempts, while his practiced hand tapped out messages that might determine the fate of entire battalions. Communication, often overlooked in dramatic accounts of warfare, proved to be the nervous system of the Allied advance. Without reliable contact between units, the carefully coordinated operations planned in England would dissolve into chaos. Signal Corps personnel, working with equipment that had been designed for durability rather than comfort, established and maintained the networks that held the invasion force together. The human stories that emerged from these early days in Normandy revealed the character of the men who had undertaken this monumental task. Private Tommy Wilson, barely 19 years old, found himself responsible for carrying messages between units when radio contact failed. His journey through sniper-infested hedgerows to deliver crucial intelligence demonstrated the courage that ordinary soldiers displayed in extraordinary circumstances. Letters home, when time and circumstances permitted their writing, provided glimpses into the thoughts and feelings of men far from home. Sergeant Robert Hayes wrote to his wife in Ohio, "The French people here are so grateful, but I can see the cost of war in their faces. We're doing the right thing, but I'll be glad when it's over and I can come home to you and the children." The bonds formed between soldiers in combat created relationships that would last lifetimes. Lieutenant Michael Foster, wounded by shrapnel during the advance on Carentan, was carried to safety by two men from his platoon who risked their own lives to save his. These acts of brotherhood, repeated countless times across the battlefield, demonstrated that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Medical personnel, working in conditions that would have challenged peacetime hospitals, performed miracles of healing and compassion. Nurse Elizabeth Carter, serving with a British field hospital, worked 18-hour shifts treating wounded soldiers from multiple nations. Her gentle care provided comfort to men who were far from home and facing uncertain futures. The mail service, that vital link to home, operated with remarkable efficiency despite the chaos of combat. Postal clerks sorted letters in bomb-damaged buildings, ensuring that news from loved ones reached soldiers in foxholes and field hospitals. A letter from home could transform a soldier's morale, providing the emotional strength needed to face another day of uncertainty. Chaplains of all faiths found themselves ministering to soldiers who faced questions that had no easy answers. Father Patrick Murphy, a Catholic chaplain with the 82nd Airborne, conducted services in bombed churches and offered last rites in muddy fields. His presence provided spiritual comfort that transcended denominational boundaries, reminding men of values and beliefs that warfare could not destroy. The psychological toll of combat became evident as the campaign progressed. Combat fatigue, as it was then called, affected soldiers who had reached the limits of human endurance. Medical officers, recognizing that the mind could be wounded as surely as the body, developed treatment protocols that emphasized rest, reassurance, and the gradual restoration of confidence. Intelligence officers worked to piece together the larger picture from fragments of information gathered by patrols, aerial reconnaissance, and prisoner interrogations. Major Susan Clark, one of the few women serving in intelligence roles near the front lines, analyzed German documents and radio intercepts to provide commanders with the information they needed to make tactical decisions. The integration of different national forces created both challenges and opportunities for cultural exchange. British soldiers shared their tea with American GIs, while Canadian troops introduced both groups to their distinctive humor and outlook. These interactions, taking place against the backdrop of combat, laid the foundation for the strong alliance relationships that would characterize the post-war world. As June gave way to July, the Allied forces in Normandy had evolved from an invasion force into an army of occupation and liberation. The initial objectives had been achieved, but the greater goal, the defeat of Nazi Germany and the restoration of freedom to Europe, still lay ahead. The courage and determination displayed in these early weeks would be tested again and again in the months to come. Operation Cobra and the Breakout. By late July 1944, the Allied forces had established a firm foothold in Normandy, but they remained confined to a relatively narrow coastal strip. The Bocage country, with its maze of hedgerows and small fields, had proven to be a formidable defensive barrier. German forces, though weakened by constant pressure, had managed to contain the Allied advance and prevent the breakout that would be necessary for the liberation of France. Operation Cobra, conceived as the solution to this tactical stalemate, represented a new approach to breakthrough warfare. Rather than attempting to advance along a broad front, American forces would concentrate their power in a narrow sector, using massive aerial bombardment followed by armored exploitation to punch a hole through German defenses. The plan required precise coordination between air and ground forces on a scale never before attempted. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, worked closely with Air Force commanders to develop tactics that would maximize the devastating effect of strategic bombers used in a tactical role. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton's Third Army, held in reserve for this moment, prepared to exploit any breakthrough that Cobra might achieve. Patton himself, his reputation for aggressive leadership well established, chafed at the delay but understood the importance of timing in military operations. "We'll give them a war of movement they'll never forget," he promised his staff. The preliminary bombardment began on July 25th, with wave after wave of Allied bombers attacking German positions in a rectangular area south of Saint-Lô. The sound was unlike anything previously heard in Normandy. A continuous thunder that shook the earth and created clouds of dust and smoke that obscured the entire battlefield. Unfortunately, some of the bombs fell short of their targets, causing casualties among American forces waiting to advance. Among those killed was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater. His death demonstrated the inherent risks of using strategic bombers in close support of ground troops, but the operation continued as planned. When the bombardment lifted, American infantry and armor advanced into a landscape that had been transformed into a moonscape of craters and destroyed vegetation. German defenders, stunned by the intensity of the bombardment, offered less resistance than expected. The breakthrough that had eluded the Allies for weeks was finally at hand. Tank crews, their vehicles modified with special cutting devices to deal with hedgerows, pushed through gaps that had been blasted in the German lines. Sergeant Curtis Culin's invention, dubbed the Rhino attachment, allowed Sherman tanks to cut through hedgerows that had previously channeled them into killing zones. This simple but effective innovation, developed by an enlisted man, proved as valuable as any weapon in the Allied arsenal. The exploitation phase of Cobra exceeded all expectations. American armored divisions, finally free to operate in open country, advanced at a pace that surprised even their own commanders. Towns that had been German strongholds just days before fell with minimal resistance as the enemy defense began to collapse. French civilians, who had endured weeks of combat in their communities, emerged from shelters to witness the spectacle of liberation armies racing through their villages. The contrast between the slow, grinding warfare of the bocage and the rapid advance of the breakthrough was dramatic. Villages that had been on the front lines for weeks suddenly found themselves in rear areas as the battle moved eastward. Communication challenges multiplied as the front became fluid. Radio operators struggled to maintain contact with rapidly advancing units, while supply convoys raced to keep pace with the armored spearheads. The logistical system, designed for methodical advance, was tested by the sudden acceleration of operations. German commanders, recognizing that their defensive line had been irreparably breached, began planning withdrawals to more defensible positions. The static warfare that had characterized the Normandy campaign was giving way to a war of movement that would eventually carry the Allies to the Rhine and beyond. As night fell over the Norman countryside on July 25, 1944, the character of the campaign had fundamentally changed. The breakout from Normandy was no longer a hope but a reality. The long road to Berlin had begun in earnest, and the courage and determination that had carried the Allies through D-Day would now be tested in a different kind of warfare, one that would demand endurance, flexibility, and continued sacrifice from all involved. The success of Operation Cobra demonstrated that the lessons learned in the hedgerows of Normandy had not been wasted. Innovation, coordination, and sheer determination had combined to achieve what had seemed impossible just weeks before. The liberation of Western Europe was no longer a distant goal but an achievable objective, brought closer by the courage of young men who had proven themselves equal to any challenge. Lingering echoes and reflections. As summer faded into autumn across the fields of Normandy, the immediate urgency of D-Day began to transform into something more enduring. The recognition that June 6, 1944, had marked not just a military victory, but a turning point in human history. The beaches that had witnessed such drama were gradually returning to their peacetime rhythms. But the echoes of that momentous day would resonate far beyond the Norman coast. In the quiet villages where paratroopers had first touched French soil, local residents began the slow process of rebuilding their lives. The scars of war were evident everywhere. In damaged churches, in fields still marked by foxholes and trenches, in the faces of people who had witnessed history in the making. Yet there was also hope, the knowledge that the long night of occupation had finally ended. The strategic significance of D-Day extended far beyond the immediate military objectives. By establishing a second front in Western Europe, the Allies had forced Germany to divide its resources and attention. The pressure on the Soviet Union was reduced, while the industrial heartland of the Reich came within range of Allied bombers operating from French airfields. Perhaps most importantly, D-Day demonstrated the power of democratic nations united in common cause. The invasion force had included soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, France, Poland, Norway, and other nations, all working together toward a shared goal of liberation. This cooperation, forged in the crucible of war, would provide the foundation for the peaceful alliances that would characterize the post-war world. The lessons learned in Normandy about leadership, courage, sacrifice, and the importance of preparation would be studied by military historians for generations. But the human lessons were equally important, that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary challenges, are capable of extraordinary achievements. The cost of victory was never forgotten. In cemeteries across Normandy, white crosses and stars of David mark the graves of young men who gave their lives for the cause of freedom. Their sacrifice ensured that future generations would inherit a world where democracy and human dignity could flourish. The veterans of D-Day, those who survived to see victory and return home, carried with them memories that would shape their lives forever. They had been part of something larger than themselves, a moment when the course of history hung in the balance and was decided by courage, determination, and an unshakable belief in the righteousness of their cause. As we reflect on those distant events, we remember not just the strategic brilliance or tactical innovation, but the human dimension of that great endeavor. D-Day succeeded because thousands of individuals, from generals to privates, from pilots to medics, from resistance fighters to ordinary civilians, each played their part in the grand drama of liberation. The beaches of Normandy are peaceful now, washed by the same tides that carried the invasion fleet to shore so many years ago. But the memory of what happened there continues to inspire, a reminder that when freedom is threatened, ordinary people can rise to meet any challenge, overcome any obstacle, and secure the blessings of liberty for generations yet to come. In the gentle rhythm of waves against sand, in the whisper of wind through the Norman hedgerows, we can still hear the echoes of that great day when the tide of history turned and the long journey toward a better world began.